Hello everyone and welcome to a new lesson in our Mega Drive Genesis Beginners Dev Tutorial series. I was planning to cover how to play music in this lesson, but since I released my Castlevania 2-player developer's diary, a few people have been asking how to implement 2 players in SGDK, so that's what I'm going to cover today. In terms of the code, we're going to be continuing on from our previous 2 lessons on the controls. So the first lesson we covered the D-pad controls, then we covered the button controls, and we're just going to carry on from where we left off there. I'm just scrolling slowly through the code that we wrote last time, but if you need a detailed reminder of what we did, then just rewatch the previous lessons. And because we're doing 2-player here, we're going to have to add a second sprite to the mix. So the first time we added our Axel sprite, and if I click on the resources.res file, you'll see it there. But we're going to add a second sprite. I'll include the download link in the video description. And we have Axel, and we're going to add Sonic too. I think everyone's pretty familiar with the process of adding resources to the ROM or carts by now, whether that be images for the background or sprites. So I'm just going to go through this step quite quickly. This is a little piece of code I prepared earlier. So remember, the very first section is the type we want to upload. Then we're going to give it a name, whatever we want. In the quotation marks is the name of the file, and then we have the size of each animation frame in X and the Y axes. Then we're going to say the type of compression, which we're always going to do as fast. And finally, the last one, this number 10 here, is how fast the animation plays. And if we compile that, then the new resource, our Sonic Sprites sheet, will be added onto our ROM. Although that's now on our ROM, we now have to add it to our actual code. So you remember how we added a sprite last time, so we're going to do that again now. We can simply copy and paste the code we did previously, and we can alter it a bit. So we're going to call our sprite player 2, and then we're going to change the 2 integers for the X and Y coordinates as player 2X and player 2Y. And now let's go through the rest of our code and see which other things we need to change or add in order to have our new player, our second sprite on. So one of the next things we have to do is to make sure that the position of the sprite is updated each frame, and to do that we're copying this spr_set_position function and just changing the parameters to player 2. And of course we're also going to have to actually, when we have to tell SGDK what palettes we want it to use. So we're going to make it use PAL 3, which is of course the 4th palette of the Mega Drive, and we're going to tell it to get that palette data from the Sonic image. We also have this important step of actually adding these sprites. So remember, we do the name of the sprite, which we gave earlier, which will be player 2 equals, then we use the spr_add sprite function, and we simply change the parameters again. So again, I've got lazy and copy and pasted, and now you simply need to change the palette we're using and also the X and the Y coordinates to make sure they're using the correct ones. And apart from that, we should be done. If you save and compile now, hopefully you should be getting this. So Axel's moving as usual. We can moving up, down, left, right, and we can attack and so on. But Sonic is still at the moment because we haven't implemented any controls. We've just made sure that he's on the ROM and displayed on the screen. Some of you might be wondering why Sonic and Axel are appearing at different parts of the screen, even though we've set their coordinates, their XY coordinates is the same. And the answer is, if you look at the sprite sheets, remember the coordinates we've set here is the top left hand corner of each animation frame, and each animation frame for Axel is bigger, so he appears kind of further down and to the right than Sonic does on the screen. If that's still not 100% clear, then just leave a comment in the video comment section and I'll try and explain a bit further. But for now, let's implement the controls. If you remember from the previous 2 lessons, we had to create a variable where we got the variable to read the information from the joypad, the input. So before, we created one called U16 value, and that read it from joypad 1, and we're simply going to create a second one, U16 value 2, and that's going to read the input from the second joypad. And all we're going to do next is simply copy the code that we wrote before, and we're going to paste it below. Now, usually in computer programming, when you find yourself copying and pasting chunks of code, there's normally a more elegant solution, but I want to keep things nice and simple here and not get too complicated too quickly. To make sure things don't get too confusing when we're reading our code later, I'm just going to make this comment here to say, okay, this is the code for player 1, and I'm going to do the same below. Remember, you do the 2 forward slashes and it becomes a comment, which means the compiler kind of ignores it. It's just a comment for the humans who happen to be reading it. Now, of course, we have to change some of the values here. We copied and pasted for convenience, but we're going to have to change everything to value 2, then player 2x, player 2, player 2y, and so on. Now you might be thinking that looks like to be a pretty kind of boring, laborious process, especially if you had many of these that you had to change, and you would be correct. And there's actually an easy way of doing it, which I will show you now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file within our sources src folder. Now don't worry, we're not actually going to be using this file within our program, so just call it whatever you want. I'm just calling it copying. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy and paste the controller code from player 1. I've created a separate file because that allows us to manipulate the text without interfering with the rest of our code, and you'll see why that's important later. So now, instead of having to replace all these instances one by one, we can instead use the find function. So if you click Control F, then it will find all the instances of that particular word within the text. And if we click this arrow here, we can see we have a replace box as well. So we can take all the instances and replace it with another piece of text. However, before we go ahead and do that, I just want to show you 2 extra modes of this function. So if we type in a value here, it'll find by case. So for example, if I just type in the letter V, it'll find a V everywhere it appears in the text, and it doesn't matter whether that's part of a larger word or whether it's just a V by itself. And we can do that example again. For example, we can type in the word player. Now, whether that's player by itself, as in this sprite we created, or whether it's part of a bigger word, for example, player_x, it will find all instances of player. So it's found 11 instances of the word player within our text. And that's the finding by case. But if, however, we click the AB with the underscore, that will match the whole word. And now there are only 7 instances because it only finds player when it finds player by itself and not part of another word or sentence. So it's not finding the player_y here. Now that can be useful if we just want to replace the players but not the player_y as well. First of all, let's replace all the instances where it says the word value, and let's replace it with value 2. So instead of having to do it one by one, we can select it by search for the whole word, but it doesn't actually make a difference here. So we have 8 instances, and we're simply going to tell it to replace it with value 2. Now we have these 2 boxes here. If you click this one on the left, it will replace the values one by one. So if you want to be extra careful, you can do it one by one if you want. I'm just going to Control Z and return it back to normal because this is a very useful one. If you click on this one, it will replace all of them at the same time. Now this can be a bit dangerous, so make sure you know what you're changing here. But as you can see here, with just one click, we've changed all the values to value 2s. Next up, we're going to do the same but with player. So with player, we want to change where it says player to player 2, but actually for this one we should search by case because we want to change where it says player_y, we want to change it to player2_y. So if we do search by case, so we have 11 instances, we ask it to replace it by the word player. Be careful you type in the replacement correctly, otherwise you're going to get done incorrectly. You're going to get the whole thing incorrect. So if I one click, and again players 2x, player_x has been replaced by player2_x. All players have been replaced by player 2, and player_y has been replaced by player2_y. So this is a much quicker way of changing any kind of variables or pieces of text in your code rather than having to do it one by one. And now we can simply copy and paste that code that we changed back into our main.c file. So make sure you copy over the correct one. And the reason we created that copying file is because obviously if we're changing the player, it will change the one for player 1 too, as well as player 2. So we had to create a separate file because the find function works on the entire file. We don't want it to work on the entire main.c. So if that's why I created that copy, and we copied and pasted all the code into there, so it only affect the player 2 code rather than the player 1 code as well. You could actually just delete this copying file if you want. So I've just did it as a blank comment, and you can see we've not included the copying file anywhere, so it's not affecting our main.c file. But if you want, you can just delete it, but I kept it just in case we need it later. So if you just look down our code, you can see we've got two sets of code, one for player 1, one for player 2. But something we have to keep an eye on is the animation, because each row has its own different set of animation in the sprite sheet. So remember in the previous lessons we defined these anim walk, anim idle, and we labeled them 0, 1, 2 and 3. So I mean that was created for Axel, so it won't necessarily line up for Sonic 2. It depends on how you create the sprite sheet, but I think at least for the idle and walking animation it kind of lines up. But you'll see, especially when we do the attacks, that it doesn't quite line up as it should, so we're gonna have to make some changes there. For now, however, let's save and compile and open up the emulator, and let's see how it goes. And you can see here both Axel and Sonic are idling, and we can move them around. We use the D-pad, and Axel's moving left, right as normal. And now Sonic can also move left, right, up, down and so on, and the animations are working okay. What's not working okay is the way he's flipped. So if you paid attention to the sprite sheets earlier, you can see that you have noticed that Axel and Sonic were facing in different directions. Now remember last time we set the horizontal flip for Axel to flip him around wherever he's walking left or right, and for Sonic it's going to be the opposite because of the way we did the sprite sheet. So if you want to change that, I'm sure you can change it yourself. You just use the SPR, the H flip function, and just set it to the opposite of Axel's. Okay, so now that the D-pad controls are working, it's time to move on to the buttons. Now if you remember from previous lesson, we used this joy event function, and we put this part of code to control the attack, and when he attacked the ground upper attack, and we use this timer and so on. If you're not sure about that, then have a look at the previous lesson. Now if you notice in the joy event function, it just says button B, but it doesn't say which joypad it's coming from, so we're going to have to change that. And just as in previously in the handle input, we created these two variables to differentiate between what controllers being used at the moment. We're going to do the same here. Now unfortunately that the value and value 2 only exists within the handle inputs function, and when that closes they disappear, so we're going to have to copy them and put them into the joy event function as well. This is going to work a little bit differently to how we use the handle input function. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an if statement with the brackets as usual, and we're going to say, okay, if the first joypad is being used, i.e. if we were using that value variable we created before, then we're going to put all the code for player 1 inside that if statement. So if the first joypad is being used, then please do this, and then we copy and paste it and change everything to value 2. So it's going to allow the function to differentiate between whether a joypad 1 or joypad 2 is being used. Now we're also going to need to create a attack timer and duration variables for player 2 as well. So they're going to be different timings, obviously, because the attacks might happen at a different time. They might press the attack button at different times. We're going to need to change the variables in this the player 2 bit, so it affects player 2 rather than player 1. So for example, we change this to player 2. And while we're here, we need to look at the animation, because for grand upper it's the 4th animation row for Axel, but the attack for Sonic is actually the 8th one. So remember, we start counting from 0, so the 8th one will be number 7 here. If you want at the top, you can do hashtag defined and anim spin dash and number 7, but I'm just going to type 7 manually here, so I'm going to change the rest of the variables as well, so that should work. You may remember from last lesson we created this this function called attack function to determine when, so that when he attacked, the D-pad controls would stop. So handle just look at the previous lesson if you want to remind yourself of what we did here. So obviously we need to have one for player 2 as well as player 1. As we've already done twice before, we're just going to need to change the variable names to the player 2 version of each of these. So don't forget any, just go through this carefully one by one. Then there's not too many, so we don't have to copy it into the copying file and use the find replace function. I think we can do it just as quick, just doing it one by one manually. Now if we save and compile, there's going to be a bug here, and I want you to know if you can work out what's happening. So we have Axel and Sonic moved in there. Now if we move Axel, he's moving a lot faster than usual, twice as fast in fact. Now can you guess what the bug in our code is? And the same goes for Sonic too, they're moving extra fast. Now that's because we made a mistake when writing our code just now that we're about to rectify, so have a little think about it and see if you can work out why. The reason why is we're actually calling the handle input function twice, when attack timer 2 equals 0 and also when attack timer equals 0. So we're going to have to change that. So just to change the code as I'm doing here, and what we're going to do is we're going to handle when to use the D-pad functions within handle input instead. So we're going to put an if statement there to determine, okay, if player 1 is attacking, then make sure player 1's D-pad controls don't work, and if player 2 is attacking, make sure player 2's D-pad function temporarily don't work too. So if we do this, if a timer is equal to 0, don't forget the 2 equals signs because we're making a logical comparison. Now what we're going to do here is highlight all the code, hit tab so that it indents correctly, and then cut it and then simply paste it within that if statement. And we're going to do the same for player 2 as well. So if the attack timer 2 is equal to 0, then you can do all the D-pad functions. Otherwise you have to wait until the attack fully completes before you can use the D-pad functions again. And again, just as with the player 1 code, we're going to highlight it all, do hit tab once to indent it correctly, then we're going to control X to cut it, then control V to paste it within that if statement, and then that should be working, but it's not because we're still missing one step. And you can see here that all the animation has stopped, that is completely still, and that's because whereas previously we were calling the handle input function twice, now we're not calling it at all within our code. So what we need to do is we need to call the function once within our main game loop, within the while loop. So simply do handle import brackets and then the semicolon. Remember the joy event function can go in main, that's a bit unusual, but all other functions need to go within while. So if we put handle input there, we save, compile and open the emulator again, we can see that everything should be working fine now. So we can move Axel and Sonic, and it's a bit hard for me because I'm just doing this by myself, so it's hard for me to do it at the same time. But Sonic, his spin dash attack is working okay. It's not working like it works in the games obviously, but it's still working fine. My Sonic is still walking backwards. Hopefully your Sonic has been fixed by now. I think that this lesson was probably the most difficult one we had so far, because whereas other lessons we could easily just build on what we learned before, we could just write extra code. In this one we actually had to change some code which was working before under certain circumstances, for example having a single player, and we had to reconstitute, delete some things and change some things and reorganize to get it working with 2 players. Now that's something that's going to happen quite a lot as you create your first projects and first games. You're going to write some code and it works for what you want to do, but then you add something new, a new feature or a new level and so on, and you realize that you have to not just write extra code but have to rewrite the code you've already written because it just doesn't work anymore. So that's something you'll get used to. Now controls are a very complex topic, and there's enough material here to do a dozen or more lessons. For example, you can do the charge shot like you have in Mega Man or Mystic Defender, or you can have the double tap run that for example you have in Shinobi 3, and you can have like the double jump, and there's so much we can cover here. This is the basic series, so I just want to cover the basics here, so I don't want to get too in depth on any one particular topic. So before we move on to the music lesson, I'm going to have one more lesson on controls in terms of having multiple button presses at the same time and how that works, and I'll also introduce another computer programming concept for you, and we'll leave the more complicated controls for when we do the intermediate series later on. Okay, so I think that just about wraps things up for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in this kind of content, then please subscribe to the channel.
I'm interested in this.
And if you want to support the channel further, I have a Patreon account.
You won't go unrewarded.
And until next time,
Farewell.